Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves, a very special show today. Howard Beck, the incomparable Howard Beck, on the show to talk Minnesota Timberwolves, all things offseason. We talk Karl-Anthony Towns. Will the Wolves trade him? What's Tim Connelly's future with the Timberwolves? Also, what might Naz Reid get on the open market? Who are some teams that might be interested in signing Naz as an unrestricted free agent? It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA. When you enter the promo code LockedOnNBA, they'll throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. And we got a huge show today. Howard Beck's on the show. We're going to get right to it with Howard. Had a big, wide-ranging conversation about the Wolves. Great Karl-Anthony Towns stuff. Great overall big picture Wolves stuff. Some Gobert talk. Tim Connelly's future, Howard brings up towards the end of the conversation. What happens with Tim Connelly? Again, a plugged-in national insider and Howard Beck, of course, formerly Bleacher Report, Sports Illustrated, writing currently for GQ, has podcasted everywhere, had his own podcast, just a fantastic also worked for the New York Times, LA Daily News, been everywhere, one of the best NBA journalists in the entire country. So we're going to get to him right away. All right, as promised, I'm joined by Howard Beck. Super excited to have Howard on the show. And Howard, you've been doing the rounds. You've done several Locked On shows. You've talked to, I'm sure, lottery teams and playoff teams, and now I'm excited to give you the opportunity to do something a little different, to talk about a mercurial team that I think is somewhere in the middle, not a contender, technically a playoff team, but not really a contender, not a lottery team. So this is hopefully a little bit different than a lot of what you've been doing.
I think I've hit every echelon of the standings and the network so far. I've actually lost track. I'm pretty sure I'm at least 2/3 of the way through the league on Locked On. But yeah, happy to be with you. And Timberwolves are one of those frustrating, stuck in the murky middle teams. I'm sure the frustration levels there among the Timberwolves faithful are high. Nobody says, by the way, I just want to ask this, because I've had not asked this of anybody in Wolves fandom. Is T-Wolves really like a like that's like saying Frisco and San Francisco? Is it great? Is it nails on chalkboard? Is it that bad? It's either Timberwolves or Wolves. What's the ranking of proper ways to refer to your team?
It is, absolutely. T-Wolves is not accepted by the locals, and neither actually, by the way, neither is, while we're on this topic, neither is Mini. Kevin Garnett made calling Minnesota soda very popular, but nobody in Minnesota calls it Mini. That's another kind of, I think we hear that a little less. That's more not just basketball, but Mini is not popular. T-Wolves is not popular. The show Twitter handle is T-Wolves, but that's only because something happened with Locked On Wolves a while back, and so here we are with T-Wolves in it. So, but yeah, it's not preferred by Timberwolves fans in Minnesota. That's for sure.
I try to be mindful and respectful of various fan bases' preference in nomenclature. It happened on the Rockets pod, which I just taped. Occasionally, I step on a landmine of like some sore spot that I'm not even thinking about. With no, we can't bring up. I was on the Rockets pod. I brought up the Thunder. That we don't talk about the Thunder here. Oh, sorry,
that's funny, and it's appreciated because I'm sure you're probably aware markets, especially the Twin Cities, are a little bit sensitive to the national perspective of what people think and that whole thing. So that is appreciated.
I won't bring up any rookie centers playing in a cold weather state with great skiing.
You know what? That's actually not a bad place to start. We don't need to mention them by name, though. The Timberwolves won 46 games last season, 21-22. And we started by talking about the Wolves being somewhere in that murky middle, which is, for once, not for lack of trying, right? The Wolves tried to take a huge swing. Tim Connelly had barely been on the job for a handful of weeks. And took a massive swing. Currently a trade that doesn't look great. lands Rudy Gobert, trades, four first round picks, a couple of swaps, including that recently drafted center we just referenced. And the Wolves win 4 less games this season. Obviously, Karl-Anthony Towns missed 52 games. I think that's important to point out. And we can't gloss over that. But how should Wolves fans feel about a regression of 4 games when this was a team that, frankly, was supposed to contend? I think everybody thought they'd be a top, I don't know, at least 5 seed in the West. And instead they were in the play-in and had to battle just to get the 8 seed.
Yeah. I will never tell fans how they should feel about their team. I will say that for me, I think it's important to still keep in perspective the fact that, yeah, Towns missing a massive, massive chunk of the season for 2 reasons. The games he missed means you're missing obviously one of your best players, but the games that he played, and maybe you're still trying to figure things out with Gobert. Then there's the games he missed. So now they're figuring things out as a Townsless team, and then he's coming back. Like, every single piece of that matters. The time he missed, the time he played, the awkwardness of trying to make this what everybody considered a questionable or at least challenging pairing in the first place work, and then not having the time to make it work. It's like all of that matters. And so I, personally, again, not telling fans what they should think, I would look at the regression and say, not really a regression so much as a choppy season that presented some unforeseen challenges, and you'll try again next season, unless you don't try because you've traded somebody, but we'll get there. So I look, this may not be a popular stance. Speaking of landmines, I understood, and I was not trying to just be contrarian. I understood why everybody immediately expressed just extreme skepticism of the trade last summer. I was in the camp of, you know what? I admire it. I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know if they've overpaid, but I admire the boldness, because it's really easy in this league to draft a couple of guys high in the draft, say we've got our stars, we'll just keep plugging along, fire a coach every few years, overhaul the supporting cast every so often, and never really swing for the fences. I'm a big admirer of a franchise that's got the backbone to say, screw this. We're stuck on this treadmill. What's the best way off of it? And just being bold in and of itself is not necessarily virtuous or correct. And whether it's the right player, the right trade, the right fundamentals and pieces in that trade, all of which is fair to criticize or pick apart at that moment, and certainly now. But I still admire that more than the just kind of muddling along. There are some franchises in this league we could all point to that have never tried anything different and have spent the last decade bouncing between occasional 7th or 8th seed to being back in the lottery to being back in the murky middle. Like, this was an attempt to break out of the cycle, and it still may yet work. By the way, Rudy Gobert is young enough in his career with still enough prime years left to make this work. Anthony Edwards, of course, is as explosive and as promising and as bright a talent as there is. Towns may fit, maybe he doesn't, but they have room to keep evolving here. And yeah, you're out picks, but teams have managed to find ways to get there without that. So I don't mean to be Pollyannish about this at all, but this is not. I think it's too soon for people to just like pile on and call this a disaster or irredeemable.
Yeah, you mentioned the word choppy in there, and I think that's the best way to describe the season. And because at first it was, how do these pieces fit? And it's easy to also forget, like, we're talking now 9 months ago or whatever. Gobert played Eurobasket. He came in, got to a slow start. Even in preseason, Karl-Anthony Towns got sick. He lost like 15, 20 pounds in preseason. And so the start of the year was, how do they figure this out? They're 10-11. Towns goes down with the calf injury. He misses 52 games. So then it's, well, this team should still win because they have Ant, and Rudy Gobert is always, he's a walking top 10 defense, and they should win. And then Towns comes back, and it's like, how do you, how do we do this? Are we back at square one, or are we just kind of like Towns, whatever we get from him is great. Let's still focus on Ant. And then, of course, they actually played well at the end of the regular season, won that play-in game, and then got crushed by Denver in the playoffs. But yeah, I mean, choppy is the best way to describe it. And I've said as much on the show previously that I really think it's we'll get to the offseason here in a minute, but it's just, how do you fit these pieces back together? Because the swing that we talked about with the Gobert trade made sense in the most simplistic form of what was this team bad at last year? It was defensive rebounding, and it was true rim protection. I know they had a lot of block shots last season, but a lot of that was Jaden McDaniels, Jared Vanderbilt kind of chase down blocks, transition stuff. It wasn't, teams shot the ball well at the rim against last year's Wolves. So you think we add a defender, we add somebody who could protect the rim, we add the league's best defensive rebounder from last season, and yet they actually got a little worse in terms of rebound rate this season. So like the swing itself makes sense in that terms, or in that, framing it that way, like really simplistically, like this, we need rim protecting and rebounding. So we got it. It obviously didn't work out in practice. And the weird thing with Gobert is even when Towns was out, his numbers were still down a little from where they'd been previously. And I think part of that is the Ant Rudy chemistry, and they never really found it this year, but to kind of push on the Anthony Edwards thing a little bit, like the sky's really the limit for him, and he's still 21 years old. So figuring out chemistry between him and Rudy Gobert is, that's on both of them. It's on the coaching staff. And I think that's kind of, that's kind of one of the key things to look for next season. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our new friends at Bird Dogs. And I'll tell you what, I got my actually 2 pairs of Bird Dogs earlier this week, and I have already been wearing them almost daily. No joke. And I'm going to be doing a lot of laundry because I want to wear these every single day as much as possible. I feel great wearing Bird Dogs. They're absolutely comfortable. They're perfect in terms of fit, versatility, the whole thing, right? Like you could wear them to go golfing. You could wear them out to dinner. You could wear them, to hang out with friends in the backyard, playing catch with my kid. And that, like, they're comfortable no matter what you're doing. And actually I'm looking forward this weekend, going to grill out in the backyard. Don't have to worry about, changing. If you're better than basketball shorts, right? You're in the backyard in basketball shorts. You got to run to the store, but you have your wallet, your keys, all this stuff in your pockets. Bird Dogs are as comfortable as basketball shorts, actually more comfortable, but they're as functional as like insert other regular normal pair of shorts here. But Bird Dogs are absolutely more comfortable every single way, shape, or form. They are the most comfortable shorts I've ever had. Seriously, go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA. You can enter the promo code LockedOnNBA. And again, they'll throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti style tumbler with every single order. And I got one of those too. They're legit. And it's free when you make your order at Bird Dogs. Again, birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA. They have shorts and pants. They're all comfortable. birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA. Enter the promo code LockedOnNBA. They'll throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti style tumbler with every order.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think that kind of leads us, or it swerves, that discussion necessarily swerves a little bit into the Towns thing too, because you have to, there's the Edwards Towns chemistry, which, they had some, they had their time together before Gobert arrives. Then there's the Edwards Gobert chemistry, and then there's Edwards Towns Gobert chemistry. And there's, it leads necessarily to the question of like, how are you structuring this team? What is your focus going forward? Who are you actually built around? And eventually it will lead to payroll issues. We're not there yet, but Anthony Edwards is going to get to that second contract, and they're going to have to start dealing with some of the pressures that go along with that on cap and tax and the new CBA and all that stuff. Again, not there yet, but the front office always has to look 3, 4, 5 steps ahead. I think time is their best friend on all of this. It always takes, I don't want to say always. It often takes longer than you would think for young players to find their way and to find chemistry with their co-stars, whether it's, whatever form that co-star may take. Gobert, more of a defensive minded guy who you don't have to worry about feeding the ball as much, although he kind of does need that occasionally to keep him happy, or whether it's more of an offensive minded player like Towns. And I also just think that, and I said this last season, I don't think it's wrong or hot takey or hyperbolic to say like this is the moment where you have to start seriously considering whether or not Karl-Anthony Towns is still part of this central, this part of this foundation, because you have somebody you can build around now in Edwards. You've had a long run with Towns. You have all of the if we're talking about the Timberwolves as one of those treadmill of mediocrity type teams, it's been the entire Towns era. Whether it was Towns and Wiggins, Towns and whoever, it's
Towns and
Butler.
At
some point, Towns and Butler, and of course they at least did break through that season momentarily. There's a certain point where you have to step back and say, are we ever going to get where we want to go? And listen, they've taken two major swings. They took the Gobert swing, and then like the Conley swing is a lesser, but it's not as dramatic. He's older. He's not. He didn't cost you as much, but it was another move that indicates we are trying as hard as we can to turn this corner right now.
Yeah.
And we need to do this, and we need to find the way forward immediately. Obviously, new owners come in. Like, you look at Matt Ishbia in Phoenix and immediately swinging for the fences on the Durant deal, firing Monty Williams like 32 seconds after they lost a series. And it feels a little bit similar in how bold the Timberwolves new ownership group has been, whether it was going all out to get Tim Connelly, whether it was making the Gobert deal, and whether it was now then in a way doubling down when you go to get Conley.
Yeah.
If you're that far down the road as we're doing this right now, it's not a stretch to say this is the time when you start to think about what Towns could get you, because you might have a more balanced roster. And also, like, I'm not ruling out, by the way, I know a lot of people around the league who are smarter than I am about basketball, from the moment it happened all the way through to this very second, believe that Towns and Gobert just isn't going to work. I still think, benefit of the doubt, I would like to see a little bit more time with them together. But I also believe that if you're trying to turn the corner and you're trying to bring into focus what this team's identity truly is going to be sooner than later, I think this is as good a time as any to start thinking about what Towns could get you on the market this summer. I don't know if they're there yet, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, and that's exactly what my take has been the last couple of weeks on the show. Is Tim Connelly has said publicly, like right after the season in the exit interview process, he said, "Hey, we're building around Anthony Edwards. Every move we're making," I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, I think he actually said this, every move we're making is with Anthony Edwards in mind and his future, and he's the future of the franchise. And absolutely that's true. But the other piece of this is related to Towns. Tim Connelly did not make that trade with the intention of then turning around and trading Karl-Anthony Towns. Like, he did it because he thinks it will work, and the Wolves coaching staff and front office thinks it will work. But they probably also knew, they certainly knew, because you're trying to think several steps ahead of your front office, hopefully, is that if this doesn't work, we could pivot, and it's going to be easier to trade Towns given the age and the contract, frankly, than it is to trade Rudy Gobert. And if you're not trading, obviously, Anthony Edwards, then you still have that in your back pocket. Can you recoup 3/4 of the picks you just sent out in a trade with trading Karl-Anthony Towns away? The question is this summer the right time to do it? Now, he's not trade eligible until like July 7th or 8th, after free agency starts, well after the draft, because of the Supermax extension. So I tend to agree. I think they wait. I think and I've said this on the show, this is the right time to at least consider it, to entertain the conversation. There were all those years, the Tibbs years and after the Tibbs years, when it was, hey, are the Knicks going to trade for Karl-Anthony Towns? And everybody in Minnesota was like, hey, just stop with is Towns going to go to the East Coast thing? He's happy here. He wants to be here. But now it's a legitimate conversation because of the team's performance. And like you said, the lack of breaking through with Towns on the roster, and the fact you have very few picks moving forward. Can you kind of do a soft reset and still expect to win with a budding superstar in Anthony Edwards, a star in their prime who fits theoretically on the floor with Anthony Edwards and Rudy Gobert? You also have Jaden McDaniels. Is now the time to explore that reset? I tend to agree. I think they wait and see how this year plays out, and there's always next year. Unless Towns has just a miserable season, he's still going to have plenty of trade value moving forward. But is this the right time for them to at least entertain that? Are we going to hear more Towns rumors this offseason, post draft?
I think we will. And I think we might even hear them before and leading into the draft. No, he's not trade eligible until whatever that date is in early July. But if you'll recall, and we've had several versions of this, but the Anthony Davis trade to the Lakers was hatched, I think, around the draft, but couldn't be executed until mid-July. The infamous Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett deal was hatched on draft night way back when, and wasn't executed until somewhere in early to mid-July. It would not surprise me, especially like this is a really weird draft in the sense that like there's a bunch of really good players, obviously, as obviously usually is, right? And one supreme one at the top, but you have a bunch of teams in the top 10 who it's not clear that they necessarily want to use that pick themselves. And we've had other years where I've said I thought there might be a lot of stuff on draft night or trades on draft night, and when people around the league thought it, and then it didn't happen. But this one really feels like the stage is set for a lot of action on draft night. And I bring that up just to say that if I'm right, that there could be a lot of movement even in the draft, teams trading up, teams trading down, teams who they've got plenty of youth and they just need a veteran now, and so they're going to trade their pick to get the veteran. Or you're Portland and you're trying to figure out, or if Dame is still here, well, we don't need another young player who's going to take 3 years to become a winning player. We need to get a veteran now. There's so much volatility there. And then throw into, guys like Towns and maybe a couple others around the league where it feels like it may be that inflection point for a team where they're looking to move off of a max player. That is the recipe for some stuff to get hatched. And maybe it can't be executed then, but it will immediately leak out then that there's a handshake deal and that, hey, Karl-Anthony Towns will be traded on July 8th, in a deal involving, these 17 other teams. It probably won't be that complicated, but there will be. I do think there's going to be some pretty big stuff like that, or the table is set for that. Yeah. The stage is set for that this summer, and I do think it's the right time to consider a Towns trade anyway for all the reasons you mentioned. They see themselves now, the coaching staff and the front office, they see themselves as an Anthony Edwards operation, and so everything should be aimed toward that. And they do have, as I say, there are some payroll issues looming. You don't want to be a tax team in a small market. You especially don't want to be a tax team under the new CBA, and you especially don't want to be a tax team if you're not near contention yet. So they've got some things to figure out. And if you could break up Towns into multiple other players and some picks that replenish your store, that it does feel like the right time to do that. It would be a lot harder to do that if you didn't have an Anthony Edwards, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's hard for a franchise, especially when you've invested so much in a player who does produce at a really high level, but they also know all of the downsides of Karl-Anthony Towns now too. They've had him long enough to know what the limitations are there.
Yeah. And, the Ant thing is so interesting. Like building around him makes a ton of sense. And I think you mentioned this, that clearly he and Towns have played better together than Edwards and Gobert have. The lineup data supports that, and the eye test would tell us that. But of course, Towns and Edwards had the last 2 seasons, as you mentioned, together, and have had, all that time. So that would be part of that advantage. And the coaching staff surely has to believe, like, hey, we can figure out this Ant Rudy thing. Ant said it in the exit interviews that he's going to go to France this offseason and get together with Rudy, and they've talked, and so they're saying all the right things. And clearly the Wolves are making it clear to these guys, like, you got to figure it out. You're both here for the next, at least 3-4 years, however long. I think Gobert's got 3 years left on his deal. Real quickly on the draft night trade thing, I realized while you were talking that similar but different, the Kevin Love trade to Cleveland in Wolves history, that was done after the draft, after the Cavs had drafted Wiggins. I think he'd even played in Summer League in a game or two. And the trade was done in July when Kevin Love went to Cleveland. Wiggins had been the first overall pick and came to Minnesota. So that would be an example, not exactly what you were saying, but an example of like, this could still happen in July and involve somebody who was drafted by a team that wasn't expecting to get Karl-Anthony Towns in July. So there's actually quite a lot of parallels between Love and Towns actually too. It related to team construction type of player, like some of the same question marks. Could Cat go somewhere and be the number 2 or 3 on a championship team like Kevin Love did? So I don't know. The more I think about that, the more fascinating that is. I guess one other thing that I think is a little bit tied to this too, and something that the front office surely has in their back pocket, is the Naz Reid thing. And Naz became a really popular trade target for all the fan bases looking for front court depth, right around the deadline in February, because he was frankly a little known player, I think nationally, undrafted guy, was a top high school recruit in LSU, and the Wolves, stole him essentially as an undrafted free agent, signed him initially to a 2-way, and then just said, you know what, we're going to give him an actual contract. This was the Gerson Rosas front office, and he got a little bit more run this year with the Towns injury, and played really well, especially offensively. He's shown some improvement on the glass, a little bit of improvement defensively. He's now an unrestricted free agent. The Wolves tried to engage him to extend him during the season. Reports locally were that they were offering him 4 years, 10-12 million. And that he was looking for at least 50 million over 4 years, which is more like 14 to 15 million a year. It's unclear to me what the market actually is for him. Could he get paid 50 million over 4 years and go start for a mediocre team, maybe a team trying to get to the playoffs? Or is the Wolves front office looking at this as potentially like, hey, we not that like Naz Reid is the fallback for Karl-Anthony Towns, because he's not as good as Towns, obviously. But could they get 60% of Towns' production at a fraction of the cost by re-signing Naz, trading Towns, getting picks back, or is it not directly linked at all? And does Naz just go wherever can pay him the most money? I mean, it's impossible to say, but what's your take on the Naz Reid situation?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think all those factors are the right things to consider, because if you like, and I don't know this, right? If the front office has determined, let's say today, as of today, we're trading Towns this summer. Well, yeah, we're going to figure it out. There's an offer out, and by the way, I do think he'd get a ton back. Let's say that they've already decided on that direction, and in part because they want to unclog the payroll, and you're gonna break him into multiple smaller contracts, and because you think, well, we've got Naz Reid, who we can plug in if all else fails. Maybe you're getting a Towns replacement back in the Towns deal for all you know. But you want to give yourself more flexibility to re-sign Naz Reid and not have to worry about tax implications, all that other stuff. If you're going to trade Towns, if you've already determined that, that's one way of looking at it. Now you can prioritize Naz Reid and say, like, this, we're going all out to keep him. If you have determined you're definitely keeping Towns, then you have to really consider all the payroll implications that much more heavily. I did kind of like poke around earlier this week just to see what people thought. Sense I got is that, Naz Reid's going to get like $15 million a year.
Yeah. Like
someone's going to pay him that. There is definitely interest out there, plenty of interest out there. There are a bunch of teams with a lot of cap room, some young teams that are on the rise that, I don't know if those are the right spots for him, but when you're when you're Naz Reid, like you're going to probably prioritize the wealth of the contract over winning right away. Whether those young teams are ready, or whether they think that Naz Reid is the right add at this point is another question. But in the midst of all that, something else that somebody said to me, which was interesting, because neither of these teams really have the cap flexibility, but Boston and Denver were two teams that I was told are very interested in Naz Reid. The Nuggets see him as someone who can play alongside Jokic and play as the center when Jokic is on the bench. The Celtics might view Naz Reid as kind of an eventual Al Horford replacement, not exactly at Al Horford's level or experience, but somebody who can do a lot of things, right? Some shooting, some rebounding, some playmaking, and some defensive versatility as a big, some ability to play in space. And so, those are not teams with cap room. Those are not teams, but it was just interesting to note that, like, okay, there are some high level teams, the highest of levels. They may meet in the finals in another couple weeks here. Who would have interest as well? Is that a sign and trade? Is that a, I guess it kind of has to be. But the bottom line is, like, the market is there, the interest is there, the demand, he'll have plenty of suitors. And it just depends on the way it breaks, right? Like,
yeah.
Where are the Rockets going with all that cap room this summer? Where are the Magic or the Pistons or the Pacers or some of these other teams that are still trying to kind of figure out their new identity?
Yeah, and all it takes is one, right? And it always used to. I feel like every year I say this, is that we're past the point where teams are giving guys like this, these crazy free agent deals, but then it happens anyway. So all it takes is one team to be like, yeah, we think he could be an all-star, but more likely it's somewhere in the middle, right? Like, he's not going to be just an addition to a contender. I think Boston and Denver were two of the teams mentioned that were interested in him at the deadline as well. And, the Wolves wanted to play out the string and thought they could maybe extend him, and just wanted to see how the year would finish out. Towns was still hurt, so they didn't end up trading him. All right. Those were my biggest questions for you, Howard. I mean, any other thoughts on the Wolves? Anything you want to leave Wolves fans with?
Only that, and I don't want to add more fuel to this fire necessarily, but I'm still curious to see, whether there is any chance that Tim Connelly is looking at that Wizards job, or whether, we all know what the ties are there. And as I understand it, like, it wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, he, came in, made some big moves, and then it didn't work out, so now he's bailing. It's more about, like, as everybody knows, he has long-standing ties to Washington, and personally, professionally, and otherwise. And so the allure was always there. He's always been mentioned as somebody who could potentially take that job long before they went from Ernie Grunfeld to Tommy Shepard. I don't think it's clear to me. It's not clear to me yet where that's going in Washington. It seems like things have kind of quieted down on that front where it regards Connelly.
Yeah.
But if he were to go, how much does that change the landscape for them too, right? Because now you've got somebody. All the questions we were just discussing about Towns, whether to trade now or not. How far do you go to keep Naz Reid? All these things could very well change if it's a different person overseeing the operation.
Yeah, and the ownership, you mentioned this earlier, the Wolves ownership still being relatively new in Minnesota, still actually technically not the majority owners. Anything could happen, right? Connelly was their guy. They made their stamp with the Gobert trade. Their fingerprints were all over that. But how quickly could that shift? And then what happens? There's so many angles always, it feels like, with the Timberwolves. Howard Beck, I really appreciate you coming on the show. Great insight. And thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Ben. Appreciate it.
All right, that'll do it for my conversation with Howard Beck. Fantastic guest, right? A wide-ranging conversation. We covered a ton. I think the Connelly stuff is super interesting. We haven't covered that on the show a bunch. I'd still be surprised, as Howard even kind of alluded to. We haven't heard much about it recently. Does that actually happen? He seemed to be a bit more sold on the Town stuff than I was expecting. We'll break down a bit more what Howard talked about on the show today, go a little bit more in depth on the Towns conversation, because that's going to be the conversation as we draw close to the NBA draft. We'll do that a little bit more next week. We're still daily, Monday through Friday. Even though the Wolves only have that single second-round pick, they could trade back into the first round. We're doing the Locked On mock draft here now too. So there's a lot of draft conversation ongoing. We're daily Monday through Friday, all the way through free agency, really. Through the month of July, we'll be Monday through Friday. So make sure you're following and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Of course, you can find us everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken. That's with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. You can also watch on Locked On Sports Minnesota. That's an app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV, so you can watch there as well on your television. A big thank you for watching and listening once again here today. Of course, Locked On Wolves is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.